The lake was almost perfectly still when the fisherman saw the shoe under the gray morning sky. It was just after 6 on a Saturday morning, and a thin layer of mist hovered above the water. Samuel Reed had come to the eastern shore before sunrise, as he did most weekends, carrying a tackle box and thermos. He was watching the reeds for movement when something pale caught his eye. First, he thought it was driftwood. Then he saw the hand. Samuel froze. The woman lay partly hidden beneath the reeds. One arm stretched toward the water as if she had tried to pull herself away from the shore. Her dark hair was tangled across her face. One shoe was missing, and the other remained loosely attached to her foot. Samuel dropped his fishing rod. He stumbled backward, nearly falling into the mud, before reaching for his phone with shaking fingers. By 7:15, the quiet lakeside had become a crime scene. Patrol officers pushed yellow tape between the trees while paramedics confirmed what everyone already feared. The woman was dead. There were no obvious signs of a struggle, and the first impression was that she might have slipped near the water, struck her head, and drowned. But Detective Olivia Grant did not like first impressions. She arrived after 8, stepping beneath the tape while rain clouds gathered over the lake. She studied the body without speaking. Laura Hayes, 42 years old, was identified through a driver's license found inside her purse. Laura had been married to Richard Hayes, a local businessman. She was also stepmother to Richard's son, Evan. Friends described her as composed, generous, and dependable. Nothing about that description explained why she was alone beside a secluded lake before dawn. Grant crouched near the shoreline. The mud told another story. There were fresh impressions leading from the water toward the reeds, but the pattern was strange. Laura's shoes had left clear marks several feet away, yet one shoe was found near the body while the other was discovered farther down the shoreline. It looked less like a simple fall and more like someone had moved through the area after she arrived. Then Grant noticed something else. A faint smear of dirt marked Laura's coat sleeve. Beneath her fingernails was a trace of dark material that did not appear to come from the shoreline. "Bag everything," Grant said. An officer nodded. Grant stood and looked across the water. The opposite shore disappeared into fog, leaving the lake surrounded by empty trees and silence. If Laura had come here voluntarily, someone might have been waiting for her. And if she had not come voluntarily, then whoever brought her had left very little behind. The search continued. Near a cluster of reeds, an officer found a phone lying face down in the mud. The screen was cracked but still lit. Grant picked it up carefully. There was one unread message. No name appeared above it. Only a single letter was saved as the sender's identity. J. Grant stared at the screen. The message contained just 6 words. "You should have told him everything." For the first time that morning, the lake no longer looked like the place where Laura Hayes had died. It looked like the place where someone had expected her to disappear. The message on Laura Hayes' phone would matter later. But before detectives could understand why it was sent, they had to understand the woman who received it. 6 months earlier, Laura's life looked nothing like the crime scene beside the lake. At 42, she had built a quiet existence with Richard Hayes, a businessman whose reputation rested on discipline, charm, and an obsessive need for control. They lived in a spacious house on the edge of town, where polished floors, expensive furniture, and arranged photographs created the impression of a stable family. But the house had never felt completely whole. Richard's son, Evan, was 24 when Laura first became his stepmother. He had lost his mother several years earlier, and grief had hardened the relationship between him and his father. Richard rarely spoke about the loss. Evan rarely spoke to Richard at all. Laura noticed the silence. First, she tried to bridge it. She left dinner for Evan when he worked late. She listened when he complained about his father. When Evan admitted that he sometimes felt like a stranger inside his own home, Laura told him he did not have to feel that way. Those conversations became longer. Then they became secret. Evan started knocking on Laura's bedroom door after midnight, usually when Richard was away on business. Sometimes he needed advice. Sometimes he simply wanted someone to listen. Laura began waiting for those visits, even though she knew she should not. There were rules inside every family, and some boundaries existed for a reason. Neither of them crossed those boundaries immediately. Instead, they moved toward them slowly. A hand remained on an arm a second too long. A joke continued after everyone else had stopped laughing. Laura began sending Evan messages during the day, checking whether he had eaten or asking where he was. Evan started answering almost instantly. Richard noticed none of it. He was frequently away, buried in meetings, phone calls, and business dinners. When he returned home, he expected order and quiet. Laura gave him both. But behind closed doors, another relationship was forming. One evening, Evan sat with Laura in the kitchen after Richard had gone upstairs. Rain tapped against the windows while the two of them talked about his mother. Evan's voice broke when he said he could barely remember the sound of her laughter. Laura reached across the table and took his hand. "You don't have to carry everything alone," she whispered. Evan looked at her differently that night. Laura felt it. She should have pulled her hand away. She didn't. After that, secrecy became easier. Their messages became more personal. They deleted conversations. Evan began coming home at unusual hours, and Laura sometimes disappeared from family dinners without explanation. When Richard asked questions, they offered answers. Work, friends, errands. Small lies, repeated often enough, began creating a second life inside the house. Then one night, Richard came home unexpectedly. The hallway was dark. Laura was standing near Evan's bedroom door, holding her phone. She turned when she heard Richard's footsteps. For one brief second, nobody spoke. Richard looked from Laura to the closed bedroom door. And although he said nothing, Laura understood that something had changed. The secret had not been discovered. Not yet, but someone had finally begun looking. Richard had begun looking, but what he saw that night was only the beginning. In the weeks that followed, Laura and Evan stopped pretending their closeness was innocent. The first kiss happened after another argument between Evan and his father. Richard had accused his son of wasting his life, and Evan had stormed away. Laura followed him upstairs, intending to calm him. Instead, the distance between them disappeared. Afterward, neither spoke about what they had done. They did not need to. A secret had been created, and both understood that discovery could destroy everything. At first, the affair felt like an escape. Evan believed Laura understood him in a way Richard never had. Laura convinced herself that Evan needed her, that she was giving him the affection his father had withheld. She repeatedly told him their connection was different. "Richard stopped being a husband a long time ago," she whispered one night. Evan stared at her. "And you think that makes this right?" Laura hesitated before answering. "I think it makes us honest about what we need." But honesty was the one thing their relationship could never survive. Their private world became increasingly obsessive. Evan waited for Laura's messages, checking his phone every few minutes. Laura became anxious whenever he did not respond. If Evan went out with friends, she wanted to know where he was. If Laura spent an evening with Richard, Evan became distant and resentful. Neither recognized the pattern as dangerous. They called it love. Outside the house, Evan slowly disappeared from the people who had once known him best. He stopped answering invitations. He canceled plans without explanation. His friends noticed that he was always distracted, always checking his phone. Whenever Richard entered a room, Evan immediately turned the screen face down. Laura did the same. The secrecy changed the atmosphere of the house. Conversations became rehearsed. Footsteps in the hallway could make them nervous. A simple family dinner could feel like an interrogation. Richard noticed. He began asking Evan why he was spending so much time upstairs. He asked Laura why she seemed distracted. Each question was met with an ordinary answer. Nothing was wrong. Everything was fine. But the lies were becoming harder to maintain. Laura started keeping a second phone hidden inside a box of winter clothes. Evan memorized her number instead of saving it under her name. They developed signals for when Richard was nearby, and they avoided looking at each other across the dinner table. Yet the more carefully they protected the secret, the more control it gained over them. Some nights, Laura promised herself the affair would end. Then Evan would tell her that she was the only person who understood his pain, and her resolve would disappear. She began confusing his dependence with devotion, while Evan mistook her attention for proof that someone finally chose him over his father completely. One Thursday night, Richard returned home earlier than expected. He found the downstairs rooms empty and heard quiet voices from the upper floor. He followed the sound. Evan's bedroom door opened. Laura stepped into the hallway. She stopped when she saw Richard. For several seconds, neither moved. Richard's eyes shifted toward Evan's doorway, then back to his wife. "Why were you in there?" Laura opened her mouth, but no explanation came. Behind her, Evan stood motionless. Richard slowly looked between them, and in that silence, the first crack appeared in the family's carefully protected secret. The crack in the family had barely appeared when another, far more devastating fracture entered Evan's life. Several weeks passed after Richard caught Laura leaving Evan's bedroom. He never confronted them directly. Instead, the house became colder. Richard watched more carefully. Laura spoke less, and Evan lived with the constant fear that his father already knew the truth. Then came the appointment. Evan had gone to the clinic alone after becoming worried about his health. He expected routine answers, perhaps an infection that could be treated with medication. Instead, a doctor asked him to sit down. The room suddenly felt smaller. The test had returned positive for HIV. Evan stared at the doctor as though the words belonged to someone else. "No," he whispered. The doctor explained that additional testing would be conducted to confirm the result, and that HIV was a manageable medical condition with proper treatment. Evan heard almost none of it. His mind raced backward through the previous months, searching for an explanation, a moment, a mistake. He left the clinic carrying paperwork that seemed heavier than anything he had ever held. For several minutes, he sat inside his car without starting the engine. Then he called Laura. She answered immediately. "What happened?" Evan could barely speak. "I got my results." There was silence. "I'm positive." Laura stopped breathing for a moment. Her reaction frightened him more than the diagnosis itself. She did not ask what the doctor had said. She did not ask whether the result had been confirmed. Instead, she whispered, "Are you sure?" Evan noticed. "Why did you ask me that?" Laura tried to recover, telling him he needed another test and that panic would not help. But Evan heard something beneath her words. Fear, not surprise. That evening, he confronted her privately. "What aren't you telling me?" Laura looked away. "I don't know what you mean. You knew something. I knew nothing. Then why did you look terrified?" Laura's expression hardened. "Because you just told me you have HIV. What reaction did you expect?" Evan stepped closer. "I expected you to be shocked." "I am shocked." "No, you're scared." The accusation hung between them. Laura finally admitted that she had once worried about her own health and had undergone medical testing. But she insisted that she had never been given information proving where Evan's infection came from. She told him that an HIV diagnosis alone could not establish when or from whom the virus had been acquired. Evan refused to accept the explanation. "You were with me," he said. "You knew everything about my life. If you knew something, you should have told me." Laura's voice trembled. "And what would you have done? Accused me? Destroyed this family?" Maybe it should have been destroyed. The words silenced her. Their secret relationship had once made them feel connected. Now every memory carried a question. Had Laura known? Had Evan missed warning signs? Had someone else been involved? Neither had an answer, but suspicion had already taken root. Over the following days, Evan became consumed by the possibility that Laura had hidden information from him. He searched old messages, medical conversations, and dates, trying to reconstruct a timeline that refused to make sense. Laura noticed his investigation. She began deleting messages. And when Evan discovered that she had removed conversations from the period surrounding his diagnosis, his fear changed into something darker. He no longer wondered whether Laura knew the truth. He began wondering why she had been trying so desperately to hide it from him all along. Evan spent the next several days searching for anything Laura had hidden. The deleted messages were not proof of guilt, but they convinced him that her fear went deeper than concern for his diagnosis. Every conversation replayed in his mind. Every hesitation felt suspicious. The more he thought about it, the more certain he became that Laura knew something she refused to say. He began paying attention to details he had once ignored. Laura guarded her phone constantly. She stepped outside to answer calls and lowered her voice whenever Richard entered a room. If Evan asked where she had been, she answered quickly and changed the subject. The behavior might have seemed ordinary to anyone else, but after the diagnosis, nothing felt ordinary anymore. One afternoon, while Laura was out and Richard was at work, Evan entered the small home office she occasionally used. Guilt followed him across the room, but desperation pushed him forward. At first he found nothing unusual. Then he opened a drawer containing old financial documents and insurance papers. Buried beneath them was a folder of medical records. Several pages documented blood tests performed more than a year earlier. There were also references to follow-up appointments at a clinic outside town and notes indicating further evaluations had been recommended. Laura had undergone medical testing she had never mentioned. Evan photographed the documents before returning them exactly where he had found them. For hours afterward, he sat alone trying to understand what the records meant. The discovery did not prove Laura had intentionally harmed him. That would have been easier. Instead, it created a darker question. Had Laura known enough to warn him and chosen not to? The uncertainty consumed him. He searched medical websites late into the night, reading about transmission, diagnosis timelines, and treatment. Every answer seemed incomplete. Nothing established when his infection occurred. Nothing identified the source. Meanwhile, Laura became increasingly unpredictable. She deleted messages whenever she thought nobody was watching. She made unexplained trips outside town and returned looking exhausted. Sometimes she seemed terrified. Other times she appeared angry, as though she were fighting a battle nobody else could see. Richard noticed the tension growing inside the house. One evening, during dinner, he finally addressed it. "You two have been acting strange for weeks." Laura immediately looked down. Evan remained silent. Richard sighed. "If something is wrong, tell me." Neither answered. Richard assumed the conflict involved family disagreements or financial stress. The truth never crossed his mind. Yet his confusion revealed how completely the household had fractured. Everyone was hiding something. Nobody trusted anyone. As the days passed, the pressure became unbearable. Late one night, Evan followed Laura when she drove out of town. Keeping his distance, he watched her vehicle turn into the parking lot of a medical building that should have been closed. She entered through a side door without hesitation. Evan remained in his car, staring at the entrance. Laura had lied again. For months, he had accepted uncertainty, but now suspicion felt heavier than fear, and silence itself had become unbearable to him at last. And as he watched the dark building swallow her from sight, he realized he was finished waiting for the truth to reveal itself. Soon, he would confront her directly and demand answers she could no longer avoid. The confrontation began that evening. Evan waited until Richard had left for another business dinner. When Laura entered the kitchen, she found him sitting at the table with copies of her medical records spread in front of him. She stopped. "You followed me. I found these first." Laura stared at the papers. For several seconds, neither spoke. "You had medical tests," Evan said. "You went to that clinic before we were together. Why didn't you tell me?" Laura pulled out a chair. "Because those records are private." "Not anymore." Her expression tightened. "You don't know what they mean." "Then explain them." Laura looked toward the hallway. "Lower your voice." "Why? Afraid Richard might hear?" That accusation changed her face. Evan pushed the papers toward her. "I trusted you. You still don't understand what happened. Then tell me." Laura took a breath. She explained that the testing had followed a health scare and that the results had required additional medical evaluation. She insisted that she had never received information proving she was infected, or that she had knowingly exposed anyone to HIV. Evan listened, but his anger did not disappear. "Then why did you delete our messages?" Because Richard was becoming suspicious. And why are you still visiting that clinic? Laura looked away. I needed answers too. About me. About everything. Evan stood. You knew there was a risk. I knew there were questions. That isn't the same thing. No, Laura said quietly. It isn't. Her answer unsettled him. He stepped closer. If you knew there was even a possibility, you should have told me. Laura's eyes filled with tears. I was afraid. Of what? Losing everything. Evan laughed bitterly. You already did. The words struck harder than either expected. For a moment, Laura seemed broken. Then her fear turned into anger. You think you are the only victim? You chose this too. Evan recoiled. You were my stepmother. And you were an adult who knew exactly what we were doing. The room fell silent. There was truth in her words, but it did not erase the power imbalance between them. Evan had entered the relationship willingly, yet Laura had been the older woman, the trusted stepmother, and the person he believed understood his grief. Their secret had never been simple. Now it had become a weapon. Evan reached for his phone. I am going to tell Richard. Laura's face went pale. Don't. You wanted silence. You don't get it anymore. If you tell him, everything ends. Maybe it should. Laura moved between him and the door. You don't understand what Richard will do. Move. He will destroy you. Evan stopped. For the first time, he wondered whether Laura was protecting herself or warning him. Before he could ask, headlights swept across the kitchen window. Richard was home. Laura immediately stepped away. Evan slipped the medical records into his jacket. Neither spoke as the front door opened. Richard entered carrying his briefcase, unaware of the confrontation that had just occurred. He looked at them both. Why are you two still awake? Laura forced a smile. We were just talking. Richard studied their faces. Something about the answer felt wrong. He said nothing. Later that night, Evan received a message from an unknown number. Stop asking questions. He stared at the screen, his pulse racing. A second message arrived. You don't know what she did. Evan looked toward Laura's closed bedroom door. For the first time, he wondered whether someone besides Laura had been watching him. And somewhere beyond the house, another person was already preparing for the secret to come out. The message changed Evan's fear into something harder to ignore. Someone knew about his questions, his investigation, and possibly the secret he had been trying to protect. By morning, Evan had deleted the messages but saved screenshots first. He said nothing to Laura. He said even less to Richard. Instead, he watched. Richard left early for work, but before leaving, he paused beside Laura in the kitchen. They spoke quietly. Evan could not hear the conversation, only see the tension in his father's shoulders. You seem distracted lately, Richard said. I'm tired. Is there something you're not telling me? Laura forced a smile. No. Richard accepted the answer, but his expression suggested he did not believe it. After he left, Evan confronted Laura about the anonymous messages. Did you give someone my number? Laura looked genuinely confused. No. Then who knows? I don't know. Evan studied her face. You expect me to believe that? I don't know who sent those messages. For once, Evan believed her. That frightened him even more. Later that afternoon, Detective Olivia Grant arrived at the Hayes residence. Laura had been reported missing. Richard had called the police after she failed to return from an appointment and stopped answering her phone. He told Grant that Laura had never disappeared without explanation before. Evan stood near the staircase, listening. Grant noticed him immediately. You're Evan. He nodded. I understand you live here. Yes. Did Laura mention where she was going? Evan hesitated. She said she had somewhere to go. Where? I don't know. The lie came easily. Grant watched him for several seconds before turning toward Richard. How was your marriage recently? Richard looked surprised by the question. Normal. Completely normal? He hesitated. There were arguments. What about? Richard looked toward the staircase. Laura had become secretive. Grant noticed Evan looking away. What kind of secretive? Phone calls. Trips. She wouldn't explain where she was going. Did you suspect another person? Richard's face hardened. I wondered. Evan's stomach tightened. Grant continued asking questions, but neither man mentioned the affair. She left with Laura's photograph and a promise to contact them if anything surfaced. That evening, Evan searched Laura's room. Inside a drawer, he found an envelope containing receipts from the medical clinic, several handwritten dates, and a second phone number. The final receipt was dated 2 days earlier. At the bottom, Laura had written one sentence. I should have told him before it was too late. Evan read it twice. Then the bedroom door opened. Richard stood behind him. What are you doing? Evan turned slowly. For several seconds, father and son stared at each other. Richard looked at the papers in Evan's hands. Why are you searching Laura's things? Evan could not answer. Richard stepped closer. Evan, what aren't you telling me? The question struck with terrifying precision. Evan wanted to tell him everything. The affair, the diagnosis, the messages, the clinic. But shame closed his throat. He imagined Richard's face when the truth finally surfaced, and suddenly the secret seemed heavier than the fear surrounding it. Richard reached for the papers. Give me those. Evan pulled them back. No. His father stared at him. Then whatever this is, it is serious. Neither man noticed the car across the street, its engine running quietly while someone watched the house from the darkness. The secret could no longer remain buried forever. The car disappeared before Richard could notice it, but the feeling of being watched remained inside the Hayes house. By the following afternoon, Detective Grant had obtained permission to search Laura's storage unit. The discovery came from a receipt found among her belongings, and Richard insisted he had never known the unit existed. Grant arrived with an officer and Evan, who had been asked to identify personal items. The lock clicked open. Inside were boxes stacked against the walls, several plastic containers, and a small table covered with papers. Nothing appeared remarkable at first. Then Evan noticed photographs. There were pictures of himself and Laura. Not romantic photographs. They showed ordinary moments. Evan entering the house, Laura leaving a clinic, Richard at his office, and the three of them sitting together at dinner. Someone had been documenting their lives. Grant lifted another box. Inside were handwritten notes, medical documents, receipts, and several small digital recorders. Evan's face went pale. Why would she keep these? Grant did not answer. She examined the first recorder and found several dated files. The earliest recordings were ordinary conversations. Laura spoke about arguments with Richard, her loneliness, and her growing concern about Evan. Then her voice changed. I know this is wrong, she said on one recording, but when he looks at me, I feel like he understands everything Richard never did. Evan closed his eyes. Grant continued listening. Another recording described Laura's fear that Evan would eventually expose their relationship. A later file mentioned his health concerns. He doesn't know what I found, Laura whispered, and I don't know how to tell him. Grant paused the recording. What did she find? Evan shook his head. I don't know. They searched through more documents. One medical file showed that Laura had undergone testing before the affair began. The results did not establish that she had HIV, nor did they prove that she had intentionally exposed Evan. But the timeline raised questions about what Laura knew and when she knew it. Then Grant found a handwritten note. Evan doesn't know the whole truth. Beneath it was a date from 3 weeks before Laura disappeared. Grant looked at Evan. What happened around this date? Evan swallowed. That was when I first confronted her. About your diagnosis? He nodded. The detective continued through the files. Another recording began with Laura crying. If anyone finds these, I need them to understand that I was afraid. Evan thinks I wanted to hurt him. I didn't. Pause followed. Then Laura said something that changed the investigation. He isn't the only person who has a reason to hate me. Grant immediately rewound the recording. What did she mean? Evan stared at the machine. I don't know, but the next file contained only static. Grant checked the recorder. It had been damaged deliberately. Someone had erased part of the conversation. Outside, rain began striking the roof of the storage building. Grant gathered the evidence. Laura had been frightened before her death. She had known Evan was searching for answers. She had also believed another person wanted revenge. But there was one final discovery. At the bottom of the box lay a photograph of Laura standing beside the lake. Written across the back were 6 words. "If I disappear, ask him why." Evan stared at the photograph. For the first time, he understood that Laura's death might not have been caused by their secret alone. Someone else had been waiting for her to become vulnerable. The detective looked again at the photograph, realizing that the lake was no longer merely where Laura had died. It might have been where the real story began, and Detective Grant now had a name to find. The photograph changed the direction of the investigation. For Grant, the image transformed a family scandal into something far more deliberate. Laura had not simply been hiding from her husband and stepson. She had been documenting her fear. The question was no longer whether someone had a motive. The question was who had been close enough to know her movements, understand her secrets, and reach her before she could ask for help. Grant ordered every call, vehicle, and camera record from that night to be examined again, certain that one overlooked detail would expose the person Laura had feared most. Richard answered first. "I assumed she meant me." Grant watched him carefully. "Why?" "Because our marriage was falling apart." He admitted Laura had become distant, secretive, and increasingly frightened. He also confessed that they had argued the night before her disappearance. What was the argument about? Richard looked toward the window. "She said she needed to leave. I asked if there was another man." Grant waited. "And?" "She didn't answer." Evan stood silently nearby, knowing the truth but unable to speak. Then Grant turned to him. "You said you stayed home that night." "I did." "From what time?" "After 9. "Can anyone confirm that?" Evan hesitated. "No." Grant noticed the hesitation. Later, investigators obtained security footage from businesses near the lake. One camera captured Laura's car entering the area at 10:18 p.m. 20 minutes later, another vehicle arrived. The license plate was partially obscured, but investigators could identify the model. It belonged to Richard. When Grant confronted him, he denied following Laura. "I changed my mind about going home," he said. "I drove around." "That is not what the footage suggests." Richard's face tightened. "I was angry." "Did you meet Laura?" "Yes." Evan looked at his father. Richard finally admitted it. Laura had called him that evening and asked him to meet her at the lake. She had sounded frightened. "What did she say?" "She told me someone was threatening her." "Who?" "She wouldn't say." Richard claimed the conversation became heated. He accused Laura of betraying him, and she accused him of never listening. Eventually, he left. "You left her alone?" "Yes." Grant studied him. "Why didn't you tell us?" Richard lowered his eyes. "Because I knew how it would look." The statement changed everything. Investigators returned to the lake and searched the area again. Near the shoreline, they found tire impressions matching Laura's vehicle and another set consistent with Richard's car. But there was more. A security camera from a gas station had captured Evan driving toward the lake shortly after Richard left. Evan had lied. When Grant confronted him, his composure collapsed. "I went there to talk to her." "Why?" "Because I thought she was going to tell someone everything." "Did you threaten her?" "No." "Did you touch her?" Evan shook his head. "I was angry, but I left." "Where did you go?" "Home." Yet the evidence remained painfully incomplete for everyone. Grant knew the timeline was incomplete. 3 people had been near the lake that night. All 3 had reasons to fear Laura. All 3 had lied. Then investigators recovered Laura's final phone record. Her last call had lasted 43 seconds. The number belonged to someone who had never appeared in the family's story. Grant stared at the name on the screen. Then she looked at Evan. "Who is Linda Morrison?" Evan went completely still. He knew that name. And suddenly, the secret surrounding Laura seemed much larger than anyone had imagined. The name Linda Morrison silenced Evan. He had heard it once before, months earlier, when Laura received a message and immediately left the room. At the time, he assumed Linda was an old friend. Now, with Detective Grant watching him, he understood that assumption had been convenient rather than truthful. "Who is she?" Grant asked. Evan rubbed his hands together. "Someone Laura knew before she married my father." "That is not what I asked." He looked down. "Linda was involved in Laura's life. I don't know how." Grant requested the phone records. Within an hour, investigators discovered dozens of calls between Laura and Linda during the weeks before the death. Some lasted only seconds. Others continued for nearly an hour. The pattern was unmistakable. Laura had been afraid of Linda. Evan finally admitted that he had once seen the two women arguing outside a medical clinic. "Did you hear what they said?" "No," but Laura looked terrified. Grant asked why he had never mentioned it. "Because I was already hiding too much." That confession finally opened the door to everything else. Evan told Grant about the affair. He described how it began, how emotionally dependent they became, and how quickly their secret turned toxic. He admitted Laura had influenced him by repeatedly insisting that Richard had abandoned them emotionally. He also described the night he learned about his HIV diagnosis and confronted Laura. "I thought she knew something," Evan said. "Do you still believe she infected you intentionally?" Evan looked at the floor. "I don't know." Grant remained careful. A diagnosis could not establish when transmission occurred, and the records found in Laura's storage unit did not prove that she had knowingly exposed him. What they did prove was that Laura had been frightened, secretive, and increasingly desperate to control who knew about her private life. Then Evan mentioned the deleted messages. Grant asked to see them. The screenshots contained a warning from an unknown number. "You don't know what she did." Investigators traced the number. It belonged to Linda Morrison. The discovery led them back to the clinic. Linda had worked there years earlier and had known Laura socially. More importantly, she had access to information about Laura's medical history. She had also recently lost someone close to her, and investigators discovered that Laura had been connected to that person's life. Grant questioned Linda the next morning. First, she denied threatening Laura. Then Grant placed the phone records on the table. "You called her 23 times. Linda stared at the records. "She ruined my life." "How?" "She promised me something and broke it." "What did she promise?" Linda began crying. She claimed Laura had been protecting a secret involving Evan, but she refused to explain further. She insisted that she had only wanted the truth exposed, not Laura dead. Grant noticed one important detail. Linda knew about Evan's diagnosis. That information had never been publicly disclosed. Meanwhile, forensic investigators re-examined evidence from the lake. Traces recovered from Laura's clothing did not match Linda. They also failed to establish that Evan had attacked her. But another piece of evidence emerged. Laura's phone had recorded part of her final confrontation. The audio was damaged, yet one voice could be heard clearly. "You should have told him everything." Grant recognized the words. They were identical to the message found on Laura's phone. Someone had confronted Laura at the lake. Someone who knew exactly what she had been hiding. And now the investigation had narrowed to the final person who had spoken to her before she died. But before Grant could identify the voice, forensic results arrived, threatening to overturn the timeline and change everything about the case completely. The forensic report arrived just before noon. Grant read it twice. Investigators had recovered enough audio to isolate the final conversation. Traces from Laura's clothing placed her beside the lake after Richard had left and after Evan had arrived. The timeline was tightening. Grant listened to the recording again. Laura sounded frightened. "You said you wouldn't tell him." A woman answered. "I said I wouldn't tell him until you gave me the truth." Grant stopped the recording. The voice belonged to Linda. Investigators brought Linda back for questioning. This time, she did not pretend the lake meeting had never happened. "I went there because Laura called me," she said. "Why?" "Because she knew I had discovered everything." "Everything about what?" Linda looked toward the table. "About Evan." Linda had discovered that Laura had begun a secret relationship with Evan. When she confronted Laura begged her to keep silent. But Linda had another reason to be furious. Laura had promised to help someone Linda loved, then abandoned that promise when the affair became her priority. "You threatened her," Grant said. "I wanted her to tell Evan the truth." "About his diagnosis?" Linda nodded. "I knew Laura had been tested before. I didn't know what the results meant, but I knew she was hiding something." Grant pushed a photograph across the table. "Then why were you at the lake?" Linda began crying. "She asked me to meet her. Laura wanted to confess everything to Evan and leave Richard. But when Linda demanded that Laura admit what she knew about the medical testing, Laura became defensive. Their argument escalated. Laura accused Linda of stalking her. Linda accused Laura of destroying people and hiding behind excuses. Then Evan arrived. He confronted Laura, and Linda stepped away, refusing to become involved. "I left them arguing," Linda said. "Where did you go?" "Home." Grant studied her. "You expect us to believe you simply walked away?" "Yes." Forensics confirmed part of her statement. Linda's fingerprints were found on Laura's car door, but there was no physical evidence proving she had killed Laura. The investigation returned to Evan. He finally admitted that he had argued with Laura beside the lake. "She told me she was going to tell Dad everything," he said. "She said she was scared." Evan's voice broke. "I told her she had ruined my life." Then another discovery changed everything. A night fisherman reported seeing a third vehicle arrive after Evan left. Its headlights had been visible from the opposite shore. Investigators traced the vehicle to Richard. Richard had lied. When confronted, he finally admitted returning to the lake. "I saw Evan leaving," he said. "I thought Laura was alone." "What did you do?" "I confronted her." "About the affair?" "Yes." Richard said Laura admitted the relationship with Evan. She also admitted hiding medical information because she feared losing both men. Richard became enraged. "But I didn't kill her," he said. Grant asked what happened next. Richard stared at the floor. "She told me someone else had been threatening her. Then she said the person was coming." "Who?" "I don't know." The mystery seemed impossible until investigators compared the audio with another recording. The final voice was not Linda. It was Richard. He had returned to the lake after Evan left, but he was not alone. A second voice could be heard behind him. Laura recognized it immediately, and before the recording ended, she whispered one name. "Evan." Grant froze. Someone had deliberately tried to make Evan appear responsible. But the voice behind Richard remained unidentified. And now investigators had to determine whether that unknown person had come to the lake to silence Laura, or to expose the secret she had protected for years. The final recording changed the case again. Grant listened to Laura's whisper repeatedly. "Evan." The name could have meant many things. She might have been warning someone about him, blaming him, or simply reacting to his presence. The audio could not answer the question. But the investigation had one certainty. Richard had not been alone. Detectives examined every camera near the lake and eventually found footage from a private road. Richard's car appeared first. Minutes later, another vehicle followed. The vehicle belonged to Evan. That discovery seemed to destroy the remaining doubt. Evan had returned after telling police he had gone home. When Grant confronted him, he finally broke. "I went back because I wanted answers." "About Laura?" "Yes." "Did you kill her?" "No." His answer came instantly. "I wanted her to tell me why she kept lying. I wanted her to admit what she knew about my diagnosis." Grant studied him. "Then what happened?" Evan described finding Laura arguing with Richard. He stayed hidden until Richard walked away. When Evan approached, Laura begged him to leave. "She said someone was coming." "Who?" "She wouldn't tell me." Evan said he left because he was frightened. Minutes later, Laura was dead. The evidence now pointed toward someone who understood the family's secrets and knew exactly how to manipulate suspicion. Grant returned to the storage unit. Among Laura's papers, she found a sealed envelope addressed to Evan. Inside was a handwritten confession. Laura admitted that she had hidden information about her previous medical testing because she feared losing Evan and Richard. She insisted she had never knowingly infected Evan and did not know when or how his infection had occurred. But another sentence changed everything. "I was afraid of Richard's business partner, Michael Cole. He discovered the affair and threatened to expose us." Grant immediately recognized the name. Michael had access to Richard's schedule, knew about the affair, and had been seen near the lake. Investigators found security footage placing Michael's vehicle near the shoreline that night. Confronted with the evidence, Michael finally confessed. He had discovered Laura's affair and believed she was preparing to expose financial crimes connected to Richard's company. He confronted her at the lake, demanding silence. When Laura refused, the argument became violent. Michael struck her during the struggle. She fell, hitting the ground. Instead of calling for help, Michael panicked. He moved her body toward the water and staged the scene as an accident. His mistake was leaving behind evidence that connected him to the confrontation. The truth was complete, but justice could not undo the damage left behind. Laura had not been killed because of HIV alone, nor simply because of the affair. She had become trapped inside a web of secrets, manipulation, fear, and betrayal. And everyone who had loved her had played some part in creating the silence that ultimately killed her. Evan would carry that knowledge long after the investigation ended, while Richard would face the consequences of his silence, betrayal, and choices.